The worries about the blunders that we made while doing it, none of which I would deny, and some of which I know more about than you could dare to know. I know things about what went wrong that would curl your hair. Still, none of these can impeach the idea that we did it not too soon, but much too late. That only therein lies our shame.
The Israelis give land, the Palestinians give peace. The biggest obstacle to peace has been sheer opposition to it by both some Arabs and some Israelis.
He was a huge icon for the Palestinian people. There's no doubt about that at all. And whatever differences we had with him, I think it's right to recognise that. I think the most important thing is to make sure that we reinvigorate the peace process.
Which Yasser Arafat will you remember, statesman or terrorist? That debate, like most in the Middle East, is likely to continue for decades to come. And to make sense of it all, we've invited our friend, the brilliant writer, world traveler, and feared iconoclast Christopher Hitchens, whose new collection of essays is called Love, Poverty, and War. Christopher, I am more confused than ever about the distinction between terrorist and statesman. So Yasser Arafat dies this week after decades of sponsoring terrorism, and the Vatican, of all places, issues a statement essentially praising him as a statesman and expressing pain at his passing. Which was he, terrorist or statesman?
Well, his achievement is, if we're going to be generous for a second to the departed, is a cosmological one, I would say. Until, at any rate, the '67 war, and maybe sometime afterwards, people thought of it as Israel versus the Arabs. In other words, there's this tiny Jewish state, and then there's this huge sea of Arabs and Muslims around it, and everyone's feeling of natural identification with the underdog kicks in. After the work of Arafat internationally, it more and more became obvious that it was Israel versus the Palestinians. In other words, it was two quite small peoples in this quite small land who had to find a way of sharing it one way or another. And he did shift the dialogue. It became Israel versus the Palestinians. But he did it at a huge price. I mean, the first of which was to identify the cause of Palestine with someone swarthy, unshaven, unscrupulous, who toted a rod on the podium of the United Nations.
Murderous, too.
But while talking about olive branches, and never could seem to make up his mind. As for terrorism, look, I mean, the fact is that international law guarantees people the right to resist if they are under occupation. It doesn't mean they are entitled to do anything.
Right.
There are certain things that are crimes by any definition.
Like kill Olympic athletes.
But that's why people sometimes hesitate to use the word terrorist flat out, or use it on.
But post 9/11, I mean, aren't we in an age where we have to draw clear distinctions between legitimate political resistance and terrorism?
Well, that's why I think the chairman's first act, Chairman Arafat's first act, widely photographed. You may remember it was to be photographed giving blood for the victims of 9/11. He wanted as clearly as he could to try and take advantage of that distinction. But he could never do it convincingly. By the way, I don't know who got that blood, but I hope they threw it away.
Well, I don't, yeah. Excellent point. There's this sort of weird contradiction in the way people seem to be remembering him. At least the first editions of his obituary seem to say this, that he was this great man, leader of his people, repository of the hopes and aspirations of the Palestinians, and yet only now that he's dead do the Palestinians possibly have a hope of actually getting a state.
His corruption, for example, was quite extraordinary, and a lot of the row that there will be among the Palestinians now is what happened to all this money? Did it go into his personal bank account? Almost certainly it did. He set up about 3 extra militias to try and control the Palestinians on top of the existing occupation. I mean, he made Gaza into more of a police state prison than it was already. Of the Arab leaders, his closest relationship was probably with Saddam Hussein in the last few years. He self-identified with dictators. He was a dictator before he had a state to rule over. These are all terrible things to be saying about a dead guy, but they're all true. And all the Palestinians basically know this, but they don't like to denounce the chairman or see him denounced by others.
Now, Arafat died in France, where he was probably more popular than he was in, say, Egypt.
Indeed.
Arafat was genuinely popular in France because he was seen as this indigenous leader, this revolutionary leader, spokesman for his people. And yet the French, amazingly, from my point of view, this week essentially invaded the Ivory Coast, blew up the Ivory Coast Air Force, I think both planes,
yeah.
In defense or in response to this attack on, I think, 8 or 9 Legionnaires. Is this hypocritical? France reserves the right to invade other countries when it wants to, but denounces other nations when they do that? What's the standard?
It's such a wonderful target, but someone has to do it. French unilateralism has always been a huge factor on its own. They claim the right to explode nuclear weapons for testing in the atmosphere in French Polynesia, which is one of their rundown colonies in the Pacific, not caring about the fallout. And they claimed the right to murder the crew of the Greenpeace vessel, the Rainbow Warrior, which went to protest about this. They blew up that ship, killing one of its crew in the harbour of New Zealand, which is respectable democracy. In Africa, they have what they call la francophonie, in other words, the former French colonies of Africa who have their own economies still tied to France, and where France intervenes at will militarily. They intervened militarily in Rwanda to try and keep going the genocide government that they had installed there. They go into Ivory Coast without so much as a by your leave. I've been in Côte d'Ivoire. You have to spend a lot of time there proving to people that you're not French. Which is actually, with my French, it's fairly easy to do.
No.
But they look at you and they want to be sure you're not French. Same in Congo, by the way. It's the last really aggressively colonial European power. And it doesn't ever, though it is a member of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council, it never seeks UN permission for any of its
Well, and they didn't even seek parliamentary permission for this move. Now, the Ivory Coast...
And if a leader of any of these countries is elected who they don't like, they usually have him assassinated. There used to be a man, Michel Foucault was his name, whose cabinet-level job it was to do coups and assassinations in French Africa.
Christopher Hitchens, thank you.
Sure.
You know, Hitchens makes a really good point about Arafat. The guy changed how the world even talked about the Middle East. Before him, it was Israel versus the Arabs, this big, uneven fight. But after Arafat, it became Israel versus the Palestinians. Two small groups fighting over the same small piece of land. That shift mattered. It gave Palestinians a voice on the global stage. But at the same time, Arafat turned that cause into a mess. Billions of dollars in aid just disappeared into his personal accounts, and the areas he controlled became police states. He talked about peace, but his actions fueled corruption and violence. And then you've got all this hypocrisy. The Vatican calling him a statesman, France praising him like he's some freedom fighter, while they're out there bombing the Ivory Coast and backing dictators in Africa. Like, come on. Hitchens is basically saying when politics start bending morality, words like terrorist or hero stop meaning anything. What really matters is what people actually do, not the flag they wave or the story they tell.
Now, on this question about the Mesopotamian War, everybody knows why they oppose it, don't they? Everyone's clear on what their reasons are. We were told wrong things. We were given inaccurate information by dubious governments. We were sort of cheated into a feeling that our delegations at the UN had overstated the matter of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. In fact, when you think about it, you'll find that it's probably even wrong to mention Saddam Hussein in the same breath as weapons of mass destruction or terrorism. I have a couple of tests of my own for whether people know what they're talking about when they're talking about Iraq. Anyone who says that Saddam Hussein was, okay, a bad guy, doesn't know what they're talking about. You hear that said quite a lot. They don't know. They don't know what fascism feels like. They don't know what it's like to see families forced at gunpoint to applaud the torture and execution in public of their family members. They don't know what it's like to see 180,000 members of the Kurdish people, at a minimum, killed by poison gas in the northern provinces of Iraq. They don't know what it's like to see at least that number of Shia Arabs killed in southern Iraq. They don't know what it took, Anglo-American, British-American policy, to put a no-fly zone from 1991 onwards over those two zones to make sure that those two genocides could not be replicated. They don't know what it would be like to be a citizen of Kuwait or Iran, seeing Saddam Hussein's army coming over the horizon, attacking your civilians in that way, abolishing, in one case, the whole existence of a member state of the Arab League and of the the Islamic Conference and of the United Nations, abolishing it, annexing it, making it part of Iraq. They didn't hear the speech from Saddam Hussein saying the only mistake he ever made was that he invaded Kuwait before he'd finished the nuclear weapon. He should have done it the other way around. First get the nuclear weapon at the Tuwaitha reactor, which we found as a result of the Kuwait war when we weren't looking for it. Get the bomb first, then invade Kuwait, then ask them what they're going to do now that I've invaded it. Don't do it, don't get it the wrong way around. We lived at this man's permission for a long time. We lived by his warrant. Only his stupidity allowed us to be as complacent as we were. And in the meantime, fighters in northern and southern Iraq were fighting against a tyrant who we should have been fighting ourselves. The liberation of Iraq, in other words, the decision that we had to move the Iraqi people and the region into a post-Saddam era, will stand, I'm convinced, as one of the greatest decisions of American statecraft, as one of the things that American soldiers, male and female, and politicians who voted for it, those who've defended it, will be proudest of in the future of any decision we've ever made. Despite the ridicule, despite the incompetence, despite the failures, despite the disappointments, let us review what we've done. First, we have removed a keystone state of the Middle East from the control and sole ownership of a psychopathic crime family who owned all of Iraq and treated its people as if they were disposable citizens. I remind you that this keystone state occupies a choke point on the Gulf and an arterial carotid point in the world economy that cannot be left to the control of a fascistic mafia. I remind you further that it exists between the exorbitant Sunni Wahhabi theocracy of Saudi Arabia and the no less exorbitant Shia theocracy of Iran, that it is the keystone that allows us, yes us, we who have the right to do this, we who have the right to insist on oil, we who don't have to be ashamed of mentioning oil in the same breath as democracy, to say, if we can recuperate Iraq, if we can recuperate its oil industry, if we can stop it being the private property of a psychopathic crime family, we can not only help the Iraqis, but we can undercut the monopoly or the duopoly of Shia Iran and Wahhabi Saudi Arabia. Does anyone think this is a matter of indifference? Or is anyone willing to get up and say, you, sir, very good for you. I admire your nerve. I wouldn't mind if you were the only one, as you seem to be. You're indifferent to it. The rest of us here, voters and consumers, all believers in freedom, might possibly want to take the view that it can't be for us a nothing question what happens.
People talk about Iraq like it was some random mistake, but they forget who Saddam Hussein actually was. This guy didn't just rule with an iron fist, he ruled through fear, murder, and genocide. Around 180,000 Kurds were wiped out with poison gas. Tens of thousands of Shia were killed after the Gulf War. Families were literally forced to cheer while their relatives were executed in public. So when Hitchens defends removing Saddam, he's not romanticizing war. He's pointing out the reality people ignored. The no-fly zones the US and Britain enforced after 1991 actually stopped Saddam from carrying out more mass killings. And remember, Saddam did invade Kuwait, wiped it off the map, and bragged that his only mistake was not finishing his nuclear weapon first. That's not someone you can reason with. Hitchens' bigger argument is that removing a dictator like that, one who sat between Saudi Arabia's fundamentalism and Iran's theocracy, actually mattered. Taking him out wasn't about oil greed. It was about ending a fascist monopoly that kept millions trapped under one family's control. Whether people like it or not, that decision reshaped the balance of power in the Middle East.
Iraq. We'll add, in the remaining time, that we have brought one of the great war criminals of the world to justice and put him and his crime family and his main complicit associates on trial in public in a country where until recently, very recently, it was death, slow death, very slow death, to possess a cell phone or a satellite dish. That we have undone what UNESCO calls the greatest crime against the human ecology ever committed, the destruction of the marshes of southern Iraq, the oldest wetlands in the Middle East, the smoke and destruction of which could be seen from the space shuttle, so terrible was the environmental decay. That we have proclaimed the autonomy of the Kurdish people, the oldest and largest nation in the world not to have a state of their own, and that where they live in their federalized, democratized provinces in northern Iraq, which were released from Saddam Hussein's control a full 12 years before the liberation of the rest of the country, business flourishes, press flourishes, democracy flourishes, civil society flourishes. The sooner, the earlier the intervention by the British and American forces in Iraq, in other words, the happier, the sooner, the greater, the deeper, the more enduring, and the more useful in the future is the outcome. I'm willing to defend, because I've just seen time, I'm willing to defend and underline and repeat and restate and emphasize everything I have said so far. So all of you who've come here under the pathetic illusions peddled by Hillary Clinton, Harry Reid, and MoveOn.org have all your work still ahead of you. And you thought it was going to be easy, didn't you? Bye now. Everybody knows that there isn't a single clever person here who doesn't know, is there, or watching this on a webcast, who doesn't know that you can't mention weapons of mass destruction and Saddam in the same breath, even though he used them against Iran and against the Kurds, wrongly described as his own people within the borders of his own country, and was continuing to incubate and maintain the capacity to recover them. However, for actuarial purposes, let me just say that having enforced the resolutions that governed this question in the case of Iraq, we forced the capitulation of Colonel Gaddafi, whose stock of WMD we had underestimated. When he came in, and he didn't surrender, I might add, to Kofi Annan or Jacques Chirac. Where did Colonel Gaddafi come a few weeks after the fall of Baghdad to say, okay, you can take all my stockpile now and put it in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where it now is, which is where it should have been? He didn't come to Kofi Annan. Hold your applause, comrades. I know I'm never going to get any from a comrades. But thanks for trying. I sort of appreciate it. He didn't come to Kofi Annan or Jacques Chirac or the prostituted, equally prostituted Gerhard Schroeder, the real blood for oil pimps and prostitutes who constituted the leadership of the anti-war movement in European politics. No, he came to Tony Blair and he came to George Bush. So I give up. Okay, let's have a look at this big stockpile that Colonel Gaddafi's got all this time. It's bigger than we thought, much bigger than we thought. We accused him of a lot. It was much worse than we thought, as it had been with Saddam Hussein at the time of Kuwait, much worse than we thought. Well, let's have another look. Where's he got it from? Where's it come from? It's come from North Korea. And it's come from Pakistan, our ally. So by walking back the cat, as it's called in Washington, we discover from this capitulation the AQ Khan network. We shut it down. Or at least we put its leader under house arrest, at least for now. At least we put the North Koreans in the frame, and they know we've got them. This is the biggest non-proliferation victory there has ever been for any US administration ever in history. That's the first thing. The second is we catch the guy who rolled Leon Klinghoffer off the deck of a cruise ship in the Mediterranean, who avoided arrest when he was caught, had to be released, because he was traveling on a diplomatic passport. A what passport? A what passport? A diplomatic passport. What diplomatic passport? An Iraqi diplomatic passport. Just like Abu Nidal had been traveling on, just as like every other terrorist gang you've ever heard of in the Middle East had been headquartered in Baghdad. We shut that down too. You think this is nothing? You think it's nothing. You want to sneer at it and say, Bush says, mission accomplished? Sneer. Go on, sneer. These achievements are real. There are four reasons for which a state previously sovereign, may lose its sovereignty, may be deemed to be outside the law. They are four. I'll recite them quickly. 1, violations of the Genocide Convention, which we have signed. And by the way, by all means, let's impose this on Sudan. And by all means, let's impose it on them for Darfur. And on China for many other offenses too. Because just as China has backed Saddam Hussein, and just as it backs Robert Mugabe, and just as it's backed the worst elements in Burma, so it has been behind many of our woes in the Middle East. So that's the first thing. The Genocide Convention may not be violated. We've signed it. It mandates that you must move to punish or...
People forget how brutal Saddam's Iraq really was. This wasn't just a bad government. It was a full-scale dictatorship built on mass killings, torture, and environmental destruction. Independent reports confirm the regime used chemical weapons on civilians, killed hundreds of thousands, and even drained ancient wetlands to starve out entire communities. Those are crimes against humanity, plain and simple. When that kind of system collapses, yeah, there's chaos. But that's what happens when you rip out decades of tyranny by the roots. The fact that Iraq could even hold public trials afterward, build local media, and give the Kurds real autonomy is proof that something actually changed. And look at what followed. Gaddafi in Libya gave up his weapons program right after Saddam fell. North Korea and Pakistan's black market nuclear networks were exposed. That's not coincidence. That's deterrence.
Prevent genocide. Second, a regime loses its sovereignty if it violates the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iraq has used weapons of mass destruction on its own territory and on the territory of others. Third, you may lose your sovereignty if you give aid, comfort, and harbor to international terrorist groups. Iraq is multiply convicted of this. And fourth, for occupying and invading the territory of other nations, which Iraq had done several times, continued to do, and was intending to do again. This is not, unfortunately, the case with all the despots we'd like to get rid of. The cheap point that Peter ends with, saying, if you're going to do Saddam Hussein, don't you have to do anybody, must reach the critical standard I've just mentioned. The four great offenses: repeated, flagrant, gross, and intentional, and going to be repeated, all of them again. It was essential that we move Iraq and the region into a post-Saddam Hussein era, and the woes that have fallen upon us, the second thoughts we're bound to have, the worries about the blunders that we made while doing it, none of which I would deny, and some of which I know more about than you could dare to know. I know things about what went wrong that would curl your hair. Still, none of these can impeach the idea that we did it not too soon, but much too late, and that only therein lies our shame. Thank you.
You've been a very eloquent critic of empire throughout your career, and as a young man, I admired you a great deal for it. Are you prepared to admit now that the United States adventure in Iraq is also an adventure in imperial activity? You asked this audience what a person who acts as if God is on their side acts like, and I would suggest to you that that person acts much like the candidate you supported in 2004, George W. Bush, in particular as regards the adventure in Iraq.
Yes, yes. No, I quite understand your point, and my response would be the following, and I hope you're ready for it. And those who,
I'll do my best.
And those who did that clapping thing that they still haven't, is this: everything the United States has done in Iraq has been imperial since 1968, at least. When the Central Intelligence Agency claims that it helped install the Saddam Hussein wing of the Ba'ath Party, follow me here, not just the Ba'ath Party, bad enough, a fascist party with some Stalinist inflections, but the Saddam Hussein wing of it in power in Baghdad. That's how the CIA claimed to have acted in 1968. The United States was still an empire in 1974 when Henry Kissinger promised the Iraqi Kurds American support in their fight against Saddam Hussein with the backing of the Shah of Iran and Israel, and didn't tell them that he was about to sell them out when Saddam Hussein and the Shah of Iran were going to make a handshake over their dead bodies. That was just as imperial. It was, the United States was an empire when Jimmy Carter gave a green light to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran in 1980, and told them that with American intelligence supplied by satellite through Saudi Arabia, that they would achieve a swift victory over the Iranians and probably recover the Arabic-speaking territories of Khuzestan, of Persia, for Iraqi control. That war, we reckon, I've been to the cemeteries in Iran and in Baghdad of that war, probably not less than 1.5 million casualties. I haven't factored in all the casualties. All of these were imperial. In other words, if the United States is either imperial or it isn't, if it is, it's just as imperial not to intervene in Iraq and to leave the status quo the way it is, as it is to intervene. In 2003, for the first time I know about, the United States intervened in Iraq on the right side. And I'm proud of having advocated that policy. Okay? I knew I wouldn't get any applause. But I just want you to know that's what I think is the distinction. No, hold, please, that's the distinction. Now, there was, not to intervene would have been just as imperialist, and that was the attitude that Kissinger, Scowcroft, Bush Sr., Pat Buchanan, and the other elements of the conservative and imperialist right did advocate, because these are the Saudi lobby who are the core of imperialism in my hometown of Washington. They said, no, leave Saddam Hussein as the buffer state. We like things the way they are. Don't you tell me that's a non-interventionist policy, okay? And don't tell yourself that, because you're letting yourself and your MoveOn.org friends off much too lightly, okay? Voila. And you thought it was going to be easy, didn't you? Bye now.
What Hitchens nails here is the idea that tyranny forfeits its right to sovereignty. When a regime gasses its own citizens, invades its neighbors, funds terrorists, and breaks every international law meant to protect human life, it stops being a country and starts being a threat to civilization. That's not opinion. That's written straight into the UN conventions after World War II to prevent another Hitler. He's also right about the hypocrisy of calling America imperial only when it acts. The US had already been meddling in Iraq for decades, propping up dictators, cutting deals, playing both sides. Doing nothing would have been just as imperial, because it meant keeping Saddam in power for the sake of oil and stability. Hitchens saw that the real moral act was finally breaking that cycle, even if it came late and messy. The truth is, evil doesn't vanish because you look away. It grows until someone takes responsibility for stopping it. So what do you think? Was Hitchens right that waiting too long to act is its own kind of crime? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you learned something, and subscribe for more deep dives into debates that still shape how we see the world today.